While boarding a flight to New York to close a deal, the millionaire was stunned when he saw the flight attendant's ring, the same one he gave to his beloved, presumed dead 27 years ago. Thomas Granger adjusted his tie for the third time in 10 minutes, his weathered hands betraying the nervousness that his composed exterior refused to show. At 52, he'd built an empire from the ground up, transforming his family's small construction company into a billion-dollar powerhouse that reshaped skylines across America. Yet here he was, fidgeting like a schoolboy on Flight 847 to New York, about to close the biggest deal of his career. The Boeing 737 hummed steadily through the afternoon sky, its cabin filled with the usual symphony of muffled conversations, clicking keyboards, and the occasional crying baby. Thomas stared out the window at the cotton ball clouds drifting lazily below, but his mind wasn't on the meeting that awaited him at the Manhattan offices of Blackstone Development. Instead, it wandered to a place he'd tried to lock away 27 years ago. To her, Anna Whitaker. Even thinking her name sent a familiar ache through his chest. She'd been 20 when they met, all bright eyes and infectious laughter, working as a receptionist at the small law firm where Thomas had gone to file incorporation papers for his fledgling business. He was 25 then, hungry and determined. But the moment she looked up from her desk with those emerald green eyes, everything else faded into background noise. "Can I help you?" she'd asked, tucking a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "I hope so," he'd replied, and meant it in ways that had nothing to do with paperwork. Their courtship had been a whirlwind. Thomas would find excuses to visit the law firm, always timing his arrivals to coincide with Anna's lunch breaks. He'd bring her sandwiches from the deli down the street, and they'd sit in the small park across from her office, talking about everything and nothing. She dreamed of opening her own bakery someday. He talked about building something lasting, something that would matter. "You're going to change the world, Thomas Granger," she'd said one afternoon, her fingers intertwined with his as they watched children play on the swing set. "Only if you're there to see it," he'd replied. And he'd meant every word. 6 months later, he'd proposed with a ring he'd designed himself, a unique emerald surrounded by tiny diamonds, crafted by an old jeweler in the Arts District. It was one of a kind. Just like her, she'd said yes through tears of joy, and for a brief shining moment, Thomas had felt like the luckiest man alive. Then came that terrible October morning, the phone call from the police, the mangled wreckage of her car on Highway 85, the closed casket funeral because the fire had been too intense, they said. Too intense for anything to survive. Sir, would you like something to drink?" Thomas blinked, jerking back to the present. A flight attendant stood in the aisle beside his seat, her smile professional but warm. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with kind eyes and an easy manner that reminded him of his breath caught in his throat. There, hanging from a delicate chain around her neck, was Anna's ring. The emerald caught the cabin's fluorescent light, throwing tiny green sparks across the flight attendant's uniform. Thomas felt the world tilt sideways. I'm sorry." "What?" he managed. "I asked if you'd like something to drink," she repeated, her smile wavering slightly at his obvious distress. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" Thomas couldn't take his eyes off the ring. It was impossible. He'd seen it buried with Anna. He'd been there when they'd lowered the casket into the ground, had thrown dirt on top of it with his own hands. "That ring," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get that ring?" The flight attendant's hand went instinctively to her throat. It was my mother's. She's had it for as long as I can remember." "Why? Your mother." Thomas felt like he was drowning. "What's her name?" "Claire Bennett. But sir, you're looking very pale. Should I call for medical assistance?" "Claire, not Anna." Of course not Anna. Anna was dead. Had been dead for 27 years. "I'm fine," Thomas said, though he was anything but. "It's just, that ring is very unusual. I've never seen anything quite like it." The flight attendant, her name tag read Sophie Bennett, looked down at the emerald with obvious affection. "My mom always said it was special. She can't remember where she got it, though she has some memory problems." Sophie's expression grew concerned. "Are you sure you're okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost, if only she knew. "I'm Thomas," he said, extending his hand. "Thomas Granger. Sophie Bennett," she replied, shaking his hand. "And I really think you should let me get you some water." Thomas studied her face as she spoke, noting the delicate bone structure, the way her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled. There was something familiar about her features, something that made his heart race for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. "Sophie, this might sound strange, but could you tell me more about your mother, about her memory problems?" Sophie glanced around the cabin, then leaned in slightly. "She has amnesia, has had it for as long as I can remember. She was in some kind of accident when she was younger, before I was born. My grandmother Eleanor found her at a hospital in New Orleans. She was pregnant and didn't remember anything about her past." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "Pregnant? With me?" Sophie said softly. "Grandma Eleanor took us both in. She's the only family mom and I have ever known." She paused, studying his expression. "Mr. Granger, you're scaring me a little. What's this about?" Before Thomas could answer, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into LaGuardia Airport. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing." Sophie straightened, her professional mask sliding back into place. "I have to go, but..." She hesitated, then pulled a small notepad from her pocket and scribbled something on it. "If you really need to know more about the ring, here's my number, but I have to warn you. My mom gets upset when people ask too many questions about the past." Thomas took the paper with trembling hands. "Thank you, Sophie. This is more important than you know." She gave him one last puzzled look before moving on to the next passenger. Thomas slumped back in his seat, his mind reeling. The ring was impossible. Anna was dead. He'd mourned her, had eventually moved on, or tried to. He'd married Rachel 2 years later, though he'd never loved her the way he'd loved Anna. How could he? Anna had been his everything. But that ring was Anna's. He'd designed it himself, had watched the old jeweler craft every detail. There wasn't another like it in the world. As the plane began its descent, Thomas pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Marcus Webb, private investigator. They'd worked together on some corporate espionage cases over the years. "Marcus, it's Thomas Granger. I need you to investigate someone. Her name is Sophie Bennett. She's a flight attendant. Lives in New Orleans with her mother Claire and grandmother Eleanor. I need everything you can find. And I need it fast." Through the small airplane window, the lights of New York spread out like a glittering web below. Thomas had built his empire in this city, had conquered boardrooms and bent steel to his will. But as Flight 847 touched down at LaGuardia, he felt like a man walking into the unknown. 27 years ago, he'd lost everything that mattered. Now, 30,000 feet above the earth, he'd seen something that shouldn't exist. Anna's ring, worn by a young woman who claimed it belonged to her mother, a mother with amnesia who'd been found pregnant in a New Orleans hospital. The coincidences were too many, the questions too urgent. Thomas Granger had come to New York to close a deal. Instead, he was about to reopen a chapter of his life he'd thought was finished forever. 27 years earlier, October 1997, Anna Whitaker hummed softly as she folded Thomas's shirts, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd found joy in life's simple moments. The small apartment they shared overlooked the river, and morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting everything in a golden glow that made her engagement ring sparkle. She paused, pressing one of his work shirts to her chest and breathing in his cologne. Tomorrow she'd tell him about the baby, 3 months along, and the secret felt like it was burning a hole in her heart. But she wanted it to be perfect. She'd already planned the whole thing. His favorite dinner, candles, maybe that little Italian restaurant where he'd proposed. The phone rang, jolting her from her daydreaming. "Anna, darling, it's Dolores." Thomas's mother's voice was honey-sweet, but Anna had learned to hear the steel underneath. "I was wondering if you might join me for lunch today. There are some wedding details we should discuss." Anna's stomach clenched. She'd never felt welcome in Dolores Granger's world of country clubs and charity galas. The woman made no secret of her belief that Anna wasn't good enough for her son. "I'm not sure, Mrs. Granger. I was planning to..." "Nonsense, I insist. The club at 1 o'clock. And Anna..." The sweetness in Dolores's voice took on a sharper edge. "Come alone." The line went dead. Anna stared at the phone, unease prickling at the back of her neck. But maybe this was Dolores extending an olive branch. Maybe pregnancy hormones were making her paranoid. She couldn't have been more wrong. At 12:45, Anna stood outside the prestigious Riverside Country Club, feeling underdressed despite her best outfit. She'd barely stepped through the doors when two men in dark suits approached her. "Miss Whitaker, please come with us." "I'm sorry. I think there's been a mistake. I'm here to meet Mrs. Granger for lunch." "No mistake," the taller man said, his grip firm on her arm. "Mrs. Granger is waiting." But instead of the dining room, they led her to a black SUV idling in the parking lot. Anna's heart began to race as the reality of the situation hit her. "Wait, what's happening? Let me go." "Get in the car, Anna." Dolores Granger emerged from the vehicle's shadows, her face a mask of cold determination. Beside her sat Rachel Thornton, Thomas's childhood friend who'd never hidden her obsession with him. "Mrs. Granger, I don't understand. You're carrying my son's child," Dolores said matter-of-factly. "That makes this situation more complicated than I'd hoped, but not insurmountable." Anna's blood turned to ice. "How did you really think you could hide it? I've had you watched for weeks." Dolores stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're nothing, Anna. A secretary from the wrong side of town who thinks she can climb into our world through my son's bed. I won't allow it. Thomas loves me. Thomas is infatuated. It will pass." Rachel spoke for the first time, her voice bitter with years of unrequited longing. "It always does." The men forced Anna into the vehicle. As the SUV pulled away from the country club, she pressed her hands to her still flat stomach, terror consuming her thoughts, not just for herself, but for the tiny life growing inside her. The drive felt endless. When they finally stopped, Anna found herself at a remote farmhouse in the Appalachian foothills, miles from anywhere. The nearest neighbor was probably hours away. "This is where you'll stay until we figure out what to do with you," Dolores announced, her aristocratic composure never wavering. "The pregnancy complicates things, but we'll manage." They locked her in a small bedroom with barred windows. For days that stretched into weeks, Anna planned her escape. She had to get back to Thomas, had to tell him about their child before these monsters could destroy everything. Present day, New York. Thomas paced his hotel suite, Marcus Webb's preliminary report clutched in his hands. The information was sparse but electrifying. Sophie Bennett, 26 years old, born in New Orleans. Mother, Claire Bennett, no records prior to 1997, found at Charity Hospital with severe amnesia after a head injury. The timeline fit perfectly, too perfectly. His phone buzzed. "Rachel, where are you?" His wife's voice was sharp with suspicion. "You missed the Hendersons' dinner party, and Margaret Blackstone called looking for you. She said you never showed up for your meeting." Thomas had completely forgotten about the deal that had brought him to New York. "I had something come up. Something more important than a $2 billion contract." Rachel's tone could have cut glass. "Thomas, what's going on? You've been acting strange for days." Strange, if only she knew. Thomas thought about the woman he'd married. Beautiful, connected, everything his mother had wanted for him. But she'd always been his consolation prize, the safe choice he'd made when grief had clouded his judgment. "I'll be home tomorrow," he said, ending the call before she could respond. 27 years earlier, Anna's chance came on a rain-soaked November night when she was 6 months pregnant. The guard had been drinking. She could smell it on his breath when he brought her dinner. Around midnight, she heard him snoring in the chair outside her door. The window lock had been loose for days. She'd worked at it with a bobby pin whenever she was alone. And finally, it gave way. The drop to the ground was farther than she'd hoped, but she had no choice. She landed hard, pain shooting through her ankle. But adrenaline kept her moving. The forest was thick and dark, branches tearing at her clothes as she stumbled through the underbrush. She could hear them shouting behind her, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. "Find her," Dolores's voice carried on the wind. "She can't have gone far." Anna ran until her lungs burned, until her swollen feet were raw and bleeding. She could see lights ahead. A road, maybe a house, safety, help. But the ravine appeared out of nowhere in the darkness. Anna felt herself falling, the world spinning as her head struck a rock with a sickening crack. The last thing she remembered was the taste of blood in her mouth, and her hands pressed protectively over her belly. When Dolores and Rachel found her at the bottom of the ravine, they thought she was dead. "Well," Dolores said, shining her flashlight on Anna's still form. "That solves our problem." But then Anna moaned, her head moving slightly. She was alive, but barely. "We can't leave her here," Rachel whispered, panic creeping into her voice. "If someone finds her..." "No one will. But you're right. We need to be smart about this." Dolores was already calculating. "Help me get her to the car. There's a charity hospital in New Orleans. We'll drop her there with fake identification. If she survives, the head injury will likely leave her with memory problems. If she doesn't..." She shrugged. "Either way, she's no longer our concern." Present-day Thomas's hands shook as he dialed Marcus Webb's number. "I need you to dig deeper, Claire Bennett. I need medical records, anything you can find about her condition when she was admitted to the hospital, and Marcus. Money is no object. Thomas, what's this really about?" Thomas closed his eyes, seeing Anna's face as clearly as if she were standing in front of him. I think my wife and mother may have committed murder, and I think the victim might still be alive." As night fell over Manhattan, Thomas stared out at the city lights, his mind reeling with possibilities. 27 years ago, he'd buried the love of his life. He'd mourned her, married another woman, built an empire partly to fill the void she'd left behind. But what if Anna hadn't died in that car crash? What if the closed casket had been empty? What if somewhere in New Orleans, a woman named Claire was living with amnesia, raising the daughter he'd never known existed? The questions were too enormous, the implications too staggering. But that ring, that impossible, beautiful emerald ring, was real. And tomorrow, Thomas would begin the journey to either put his ghosts to rest forever, or discover that some miracles were worth waiting 27 years to find. In the shadows of his hotel room, Thomas Granger made a decision that would change everything. He was going to New Orleans. The humid New Orleans air hit Thomas like a wall as he stepped off the plane at Louis Armstrong International Airport. Even in late October, the city clung to its summer heat, thick and heavy with the promise of afternoon thunderstorms. He'd left New York on the first flight out, barely pausing to pack a bag or make excuses to Rachel about extending his business trip. Marcus Webb had texted him an address in the Bywater district. A far cry from the tourist-friendly French Quarter, Thomas rented a nondescript sedan and drove through neighborhoods that spoke of modest dreams and working-class resilience. Shotgun houses lined the streets in faded pastels, their narrow porches adorned with hanging ferns and wind chimes that tinkled in the breeze. The address led him to a pale yellow house with white trim, its small front garden bursting with late-season roses and jasmine. A hand-painted sign by the front steps read, "Bennett Family," in cheerful blue letters. Thomas parked across the street, his heart hammering against his ribs. For an hour, he sat in his car and watched. The house seemed peaceful, almost sleepy in the afternoon heat. An elderly woman, Eleanor, he assumed, emerged to water the plants, moving slowly but purposefully. She had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore a simple house dress that had seen better days, but was immaculately clean. At 3:15, a battered Honda Civic pulled into the narrow driveway. Thomas held his breath as a woman got out of the passenger side, even from across the street. Even 27 years later, he knew. Anna, she was older, of course. Her chestnut hair was now streaked with gray and pulled back in a practical ponytail. She'd filled out slightly, the way women do as they move through their 40s. But she moved with the same fluid grace he remembered. She wore scrubs, mint green with small floral prints, and carried a canvas bag over her shoulder. Thomas gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. She was alive. Anna Whitaker was alive, walking up the steps to that little yellow house like it was the most natural thing in the world. The driver of the Honda got out too, a middle-aged Latina woman who embraced Anna warmly before driving away. Thomas watched Anna disappear inside the house, then forced himself to breathe. Claire Bennett. That's who she was now. A woman with no memories of her past, living a quiet life in New Orleans with her daughter and the elderly woman who'd taken them in. Thomas wondered what she did for work, what made her laugh, whether she still hummed while she folded laundry. His phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. More info coming. Medical records show severe head trauma, consistent with fall. No identification when admitted. Someone paid for private room. Expenses. Anonymous donor. Getting warmer. Thomas stared at the house until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Lights came on in the windows, and he caught glimpses of the three women moving about inside. At one point, Anna, Claire, appeared at the front window, and Thomas ducked instinctively, though she was too far away to see him clearly. He drove back to his hotel that night in a daze. The Marriott on Canal Street felt surreal after the intimate domesticity of the Bennett house. He ordered room service but couldn't eat, his mind racing with questions and possibilities. The next morning, Thomas returned to Bywater. This time, he positioned himself at a coffee shop with outdoor seating 2 blocks away, where he could observe the house without being obvious. At 7:30, Sophie emerged in her flight attendant uniform, climbed into a cab and disappeared toward the airport. 30 minutes later, Anna came out with Eleanor. They walked slowly down the street, Eleanor's arm linked through Anna's in a gesture of both affection and support. Thomas followed at a distance, his heart in his throat. They stopped at a small fabric shop called Threads and Dreams. Through the window, Thomas watched Anna examine bolts of colorful cloth, while Eleanor chatted with the elderly shop owner. Anna's face lit up as she touched a particular piece of silk, and Thomas felt a stab of recognition. She'd always loved beautiful fabrics, had dreamed of designing clothes before they'd met. When they emerged 20 minutes later, Anna carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. They walked another block to a community center where a sign advertised Senior Social Hour, 10 a.m. daily. Eleanor kissed Anna's cheek and went inside, while Anna continued alone. Thomas followed her to a small seamstress shop in a converted Victorian house. The sign read, Alterations by Claire, Expert Tailoring and Custom Work. Anna pulled keys from her purse and unlocked the front door. Through the large windows, Thomas could see her moving around inside, turning on lights, arranging her workspace. She hung up her jacket and put on an apron, then settled at an old Singer sewing machine. Her movements were confident, practiced. Whatever else she'd lost, she'd retained her skill with needle and thread. Thomas found himself mesmerized by the simple domesticity of her routine. This was Anna's life now. Quiet, modest, purposeful. No memory of Thomas Granger or the empire he'd built. No knowledge of the daughter she'd raised or the years they'd lost. A tap on his shoulder made him jump. You've been watching my house for 2 days. Thomas spun around to find Eleanor Bennett standing behind him, her blue eyes sharp with intelligence and suspicion. Up close, she was smaller than she'd appeared from across the street. But there was steel in her posture that reminded him of his own grandmother. I'm sorry, No, you're not sorry yet, but you might be. Eleanor stepped closer, studying his face with unnerving intensity. Who are you? And what do you want with my girls? Thomas felt caught between truth and caution. This woman had protected Anna and Sophie for 27 years. She deserved honesty, but the truth was so complicated, so potentially devastating. My name is Thomas Granger, he said finally. I think I knew Claire a long time ago, before her accident. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but Thomas saw something flicker in her eyes. Claire doesn't remember her life before the accident. The doctors said the trauma was too severe. I know, but I saw Sophie on a flight, and she was wearing a ring that belonged to someone I once knew, someone I loved very much. The emerald ring. It wasn't a question. You know about it. Eleanor glanced toward the seamstress shop where Anna worked, then back at Thomas. Claire was wearing it when I found her at the hospital. She was unconscious, badly injured, and very pregnant. The ring was the only thing she had that seemed personal. What did the police say about how she got there? Police? Eleanor's laugh was bitter. Honey, this was Charity Hospital in 1997. A young woman with no identification, no insurance, no family to claim her. The police barely filled out a report. If I hadn't taken her home with me, she would have ended up in the system. And Sophie, she shook her head. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude toward this woman who'd stepped in when Anna needed her most. Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to believe that I'm not trying to hurt anyone. Do you think Claire's accident might not have been an accident? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the seamstress shop. I've wondered about that for 27 years, she said finally. The injuries, the location where she was found, the fact that someone paid her hospital bills anonymously. It never added up. Someone paid her bills, Cash payments, made through a lawyer, covered everything. The private room, the medical care, even some of the rehabilitation. When I asked about it, the lawyer said his client wanted to remain anonymous, said it was a matter of conscience. Thomas felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Dolores and Rachel had paid to keep Anna hidden, to ensure she survived but never remembered. They'd wanted her alive but erased, a living ghost who could never return to claim her old life. Eleanor, I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible. The older woman straightened, preparing herself. I've been waiting 27 years for someone to tell me the truth about Claire. I'm ready. Thomas took a deep breath and began to speak, watching Eleanor's face as he told her about Anna Whitaker, about their love affair, about the pregnancy Anna had never gotten to announce. He told her about the fake accident, the closed casket funeral, the years of mourning a woman who wasn't really dead. When he finished, Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "Can you prove any of this?" "I can prove I designed that ring specifically for Anna. I can prove we were engaged. I can prove the timing matches perfectly with Claire's appearance at the hospital. And Sophie. If Claire is really Anna, then Sophie is my daughter." Eleanor studied his face, seeming to weigh his words against years of instinct and observation. "There's something else," she said slowly. "Claire has nightmares sometimes. She calls out in her sleep. Names, places. One name she says a lot is Thomas. The words hit him like a physical blow. She remembers. Not consciously, but sometimes I think the memories are there, locked away where the trauma can't touch them." Eleanor looked toward the seamstress shop again. "If you're really who you say you are, then my girls have been living a lie for their entire lives. I know, and I know how much that must hurt them. But Eleanor, if I'm right, then the people who did this to Anna are still out there. They're still free." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Then we'd better do something about that." "Don't you think?" Eleanor insisted they wait until evening. "Claire needs time to process her workday," she explained as they sat in the hotel lobby, planning their approach. "And Sophie should be there. If this is really happening, they both deserve to hear it together." Thomas spent the afternoon in agony, second-guessing everything. What if he was wrong? What if Claire wasn't Anna, and he was about to destroy the peaceful life of an innocent woman? But every time doubt crept in, he remembered the ring, the timeline, the way his heart had recognized her even after 27 years. At 6 o'clock, Eleanor knocked on his hotel room door. "It's time." The walk to the Bywater house felt like the longest of Thomas's life. Evening was settling over New Orleans, bringing with it the sounds of dinner being prepared and children playing in yards. The normalcy of it all made what they were about to do seem even more surreal. Sophie's Honda was in the driveway. She'd returned from her flight that afternoon. Through the windows, Thomas could see the three women moving around the kitchen, their easy domesticity a testament to years of shared routine. Eleanor squeezed his arm. "Remember, we go slow no matter what you see, no matter what you remember, we don't overwhelm her." Thomas nodded, though every instinct screamed at him to run to the door, to take Anna in his arms and never let her go. Instead, he followed Eleanor up the front steps and waited as she rang the doorbell. Sophie answered, still in her flight attendant uniform, but with her hair down and her shoes kicked off. "Grandma Eleanor, did you forget your key again?" she started to say, then stopped when she saw Thomas. Recognition flickered across her face. "Mr. Granger, what are you doing here?" "Sophie, honey, I need you to trust me," Eleanor said gently. "This gentleman has some information about your mother's past." "About the ring." Sophie's hand went instinctively to her throat where the emerald hung. "What kind of information?" "The kind that might change everything," Eleanor replied. "Can we come in?" Sophie hesitated, then stepped aside. The living room was small but cozy, filled with mismatched furniture that somehow worked together perfectly. Photographs covered every surface. Sophie at various ages, Eleanor and Claire together, family moments captured in cheap frames that spoke of love rather than money. "Mom's in the kitchen," Sophie said, her voice uncertain. "She's making her famous jambalaya." As if summoned by their voices, Claire appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She wore jeans and a soft blue sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. When she saw Thomas, she froze. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the room. Thomas felt 27 years collapse into nothing, She was older, yes, and the spark of recognition he'd hoped for wasn't there. But this was Anna, his Anna, the woman he'd loved more than his own life. "Claire," Eleanor said softly, "this is Thomas Granger. He's come a long way to see you." Claire's brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry, have we met?" The question was a knife to Thomas's heart, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "A long time ago, you probably don't remember." "I don't remember much of anything from before my accident," Claire said, her tone apologetic. "Eleanor, what's this about?" Eleanor guided them all to sit down, Claire and Sophie on the sofa, Thomas in the armchair across from them. He could see Anna's face clearly now, could catalog the changes time had brought. Her eyes were the same, that incredible green that had captivated him decades ago, but there were lines around them now, and a wariness that the young Anna had never possessed. "Claire," Thomas began, his voice rougher than he'd intended, "I knew you before your accident. We were engaged." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Sophie's mouth fell open, while Claire simply stared at him with no recognition whatsoever. "Engaged," Claire repeated slowly. "But that's impossible. I don't remember being engaged to anyone." Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, carefully preserved for 27 years. He handed the first one to Claire with trembling fingers. It showed the two of them at a county fair. Thomas, with his arm around a laughing young woman who was unmistakably Claire. They were both so young, so carefree, so cotton candy in their hands and pure joy on their faces. Claire stared at the photograph, her breathing becoming shallow. This is me. Your name was Anna Whitaker then," Thomas said gently. "We met at a law firm where you worked. We dated for 6 months before I proposed." He handed her another photograph, the proposal itself, captured by a friend Thomas had secretly asked to document the moment. Anna was crying happy tears as Thomas knelt before her in the same park where they'd shared so many lunches. "I don't understand," Claire whispered, her voice beginning to shake. "Why don't I remember any of this?" Sophie leaned over to look at the photographs, her face pale with shock. "Mom, you look so happy." Thomas showed them more pictures, quiet moments in their apartment. Anna cooking dinner while Thomas worked at the kitchen table, the two of them dancing in their living room to music only they could hear. In every image, their love was palpable, radiating from the photographs like warmth. "We were planning to be married in the spring," Thomas continued, his own voice breaking slightly. "You were working on your dress. You were so talented with a needle, just like you are now. You wanted a simple ceremony, just family and close friends." Claire's hands were shaking as she held the photographs. "What happened to me? Why can't I remember?" Thomas exchanged a glance with Eleanor. They'd agreed to go slowly, but the questions were coming whether they were ready or not. "You disappeared," he said simply. "One day you were there, planning our future, and the next day the police called to tell me you'd died in a car accident. But I didn't die," Claire said, confusion evident in every word. "No, you didn't die." Thomas reached into the envelope again and pulled out one more photograph, this one of the emerald ring on Anna's finger. "I designed this ring specifically for you. There's only one like it in the world." Sophie's hand flew to her throat. "The ring. Your mother was wearing it when Eleanor found her at the hospital," Thomas said. "It's how I knew when I saw you wearing it on the plane. I knew Anna had to be alive." Claire stood up abruptly, pacing to the window with her back to them. Thomas could see her shoulders shaking. "Sophie," she said without turning around. "You said this man was asking about the ring on the plane." "Yes." "Mom? He looked like he'd seen a ghost." Claire turned back to face Thomas, tears streaming down her face. "If what you're saying is true, if I really was this Anna person, then you thought I was dead for 27 years. 27 years, 3 months, and 16 days, Thomas said quietly. The precision of his answer seemed to hit Claire like a physical blow. She sank back onto the sofa, staring at him with new understanding. "You never forgot me. Never. Not for a single day." Sophie was studying the photographs with growing amazement. "Mom, look at this one." She held up a picture of Anna and Thomas together, both of them laughing at something off camera. "You have the same smile, the same exact smile. Eleanor spoke for the first time since the introductions. "Claire, honey, there's something else you need to know." Claire looked at her with eyes full of trust and growing fear. "What?" "Thomas, show her the other photographs," with hands that shook slightly. Thomas pulled out a final set of pictures. These showed Anna at various stages of early pregnancy, her hand on her still small belly, Thomas's hand covering hers, both of them glowing with anticipation. "You were pregnant when you disappeared," Thomas said softly. "About 3 months along." Sophie's face went completely white. 3 months. The timing matches exactly with your birth," Eleanor said gently. "Claire was 6 months pregnant when I found her. You were born premature, but healthy." The room fell into absolute silence. Sophie stared at Thomas with new eyes, seeing for the first time the resemblance that had been there all along. The shape of her jaw, the way she gestured with her hands, the stubborn set of her chin when she was determined. "Are you saying," Sophie whispered, "that you're my father?" Thomas met her gaze, his heart breaking and soaring simultaneously. "If Claire is really Anna, then yes. You're my daughter, the daughter I never knew I had." Claire stood up again. Moving to stand behind Sophie's chair, her hands fell protectively on her daughter's shoulders, and Thomas recognized the gesture. Anna had always been fiercely protective of the things she loved. "This is a lot to process," Claire said, her voice stronger now despite the tears. "Even if I can't remember, even if everything you're saying is true, we've built a life here. Sophie and I, we're a family." "I know," Thomas said quickly. "I'm not here to disrupt anything. I needed to know. I needed to see if you were really alive." Sophie stood up and walked over to him, studying his face with an intensity that reminded him painfully of Anna. "Can you prove it, that you're my father?" "DNA test," Thomas said immediately. "We can do it tomorrow if you want." Sophie nodded slowly, then did something that took Thomas completely by surprise. She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers gentle against his skin. "I have your eyes," she said simply. And in that moment, Thomas Granger felt his broken heart begin to heal. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical New Orleans weather that seemed to mirror the emotional atmosphere in the Bennett house. Thomas had barely slept, his mind racing between hope and terror. What if the DNA test proved he was wrong? What if Sophie wasn't his daughter, and Claire wasn't Anna? But deeper than that fear was another one. What if he was right, and the truth destroyed the peaceful life these women had built? Eleanor had insisted Thomas stay for breakfast. "If we're going to turn everyone's world upside down, we might as well do it properly fed," she'd said with the practical wisdom of someone who'd weathered many storms. Claire moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, making coffee and scrambled eggs while Sophie sat at the small table, turning the photographs over and over in her hands. The resemblance between Sophie and Thomas was undeniable in the morning light, not just physical, but in the way she tilted her head when thinking, the way her fingers drummed against the table when she was nervous. "I've been thinking," Sophie said suddenly, looking up at Thomas, "about things that never made sense before." Thomas set down his coffee cup. "What kind of things?" "My blood type. I'm AB negative, really rare. Mom is O positive. Eleanor is a positive. It never added up. But when I asked about it, Mom would get this look." She glanced at Claire, who was standing very still by the stove, like the question hurt her somehow. Claire turned around, her face pale. "I always assumed you got it from your father, the father I couldn't remember." Eleanor spoke up quietly. "AB negative. That's what it said on your medical bracelet, Thomas. When you were in the hospital after that construction accident 5 years ago, I remember because Sophie and I were worried it might be hereditary." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Thomas felt something settle in his chest. Not proof. Exactly. But another piece of evidence that felt like destiny arranging itself. "There's something else," Sophie continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've always been good with numbers, with business stuff. It drives me crazy when people are inefficient. Mom says I get these moods where I pace around the house rearranging things and making lists." She looked directly at Thomas. "Eleanor says you built a billion-dollar company from nothing. That takes a certain kind of mind." "It does," Thomas agreed, remembering his own younger self. Driven, organized, unable to rest when things weren't exactly right. "But Sophie, those could be coincidences." "Maybe, but then there's this." Sophie reached behind her neck, and unclasped the emerald ring, letting it pool in her palm. "I've worn this every day since I was 16. Eleanor gave it to me for my birthday. Said it was the only thing Mom had when she found her. But Thomas, when I put this on, it was like coming home. Does that make sense?" Thomas stared at the ring, remembering the day he'd commissioned it. The old jeweler had asked what made Anna special, and Thomas had talked for an hour about her laugh, her kindness, the way she made even ordinary moments feel magical. The craftsman had listened carefully, then created something that captured all of that. Elegant but not ostentatious, unique but somehow timeless. "It makes perfect sense," he said quietly. Claire had been silent throughout this exchange, but now she moved to the table and sat down heavily. "I want to try something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas, will you tell me about her? About Anna? Not just the facts, but who was she?" Thomas felt his throat tighten. "How do you describe the love of your life to someone who used to be her?" "She was light," he began slowly. "Anna could find joy in anything. A perfect cup of coffee, a song on the radio, the way sunlight looked coming through our kitchen window. She laughed with her whole body, and when she was really happy, she'd do this little dance while she was cooking." Claire's breath caught. "What kind of dance?" "Just swaying. Really, hip-hop mixed with ballet, completely unself-conscious. She'd spin around and laugh if she caught me watching." Thomas smiled at the memory. "She was always humming too, old songs. New songs. Songs she made up. The apartment was never quiet when Anna was there." Something flickered across Claire's face. Pain, confusion, a glimmer of something deeper. "Go on?" "She wanted to open a bakery someday. She'd spend hours planning it out. What kind of pastries she'd make, how she'd decorate the space. She had this recipe for lavender honey cookies that she was always perfecting." Thomas paused, studying Claire's expression. "She was going to call it Sweet Dreams Bakery." Claire stood up abruptly, her hand pressed to her forehead. There's something." She closed her eyes tightly. "Sometimes I dream about a bakery, white walls, purple flowers in the window. I can smell honey and flour, and there's music playing, and someone is..." Her eyes snapped open, filled with tears. "Someone is singing, a man's voice." Thomas's heart nearly stopped. "Anna, I used to sing to you while you baked. You said it made the cookies taste better." "What song?" Claire whispered. Without thinking, Thomas began to hum softly, then sing, "The way you look tonight. Lovely. Never, never change." Claire's legs gave out. Sophie caught her as she sank back into the chair, tears streaming down her face. "I know that song," she gasped. "I know it. In my dreams. Someone sings it while I'm baking, and I feel so happy, so loved." Eleanor reached across the table and took Claire's hand. "Honey, what else do you remember?" "Fragments. Pieces." Claire wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "A man with kind eyes teaching me to dance in a tiny living room. Falling asleep on someone's chest while he reads aloud. Planning a wedding. God, I can almost see the dress I was making. Simple, with lace sleeves." "You made the dress yourself," Thomas confirmed, his own voice thick with emotion. "You worked on it every evening after dinner. You wouldn't let me see it. Said it was bad luck." "The morning," Claire continued, her voice growing stronger as the memories surfaced. "There was a morning when I was so excited about something. I had news, important news, and I was going to tell someone that night, over dinner, with candles." Her hand went to her stomach unconsciously. "I was pregnant. I was going to tell you I was pregnant." Thomas reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I never knew. I never got the chance to hear you say it." Sophie was crying now too, watching her mother remember a life that had been stolen from her. "Mom, what else? What else do you remember?" "Pain," Claire said immediately, her face darkening. "Terror, being taken somewhere against my will. A woman with cold eyes and an expensive purse," she said. Claire's breathing became labored. "She said I wasn't good enough, that I was nothing." Thomas felt rage building in his chest. "My mother, Dolores Granger. And there was another woman, younger, beautiful, but bitter. She looked at me like she wanted me dead. Rachel, my wife." The words tasted like poison in Thomas's mouth. Claire pulled her hands free and stood up, pacing to the window. They kept me somewhere. A farmhouse, I think, locked in a room. I was so scared, not just for me, but for the baby. I knew I had to get away, had to get back to... She turned to look at Thomas. Back to you. Anna, what happened? How did you get hurt? I tried to escape. It was dark, raining. I was running through the woods, and I couldn't see where I was going. There was a cliff, a ravine. She touched the back of her head instinctively. I fell. Everything went black. The room was silent except for the soft sound of crying. Sophie had her hands pressed to her mouth, staring at her mother with horror and admiration. They left me to die, Claire continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. But someone found me, took me to a hospital. I found you, Eleanor said softly. 3 days later, the doctors said you'd been there with no identification. No family. Someone had paid for your care, but they wouldn't say who. Thomas felt the final pieces clicking into place. They paid to keep you alive but anonymous, alive but erased. Sophie stood up suddenly, fury radiating from every line of her body. They stole our lives, all of our lives. You lost 27 years with Mom. Mom lost her entire identity, and I grew up without a father because those monsters wanted to play God. Thomas looked at his daughter, because there was no doubt now, DNA test or no DNA test, and saw his own determination reflected in her eyes. Sophie, I want you to know that Eleanor gave you something I never could have. She gave you love, stability, a real home. I'm grateful to her for that, but we still deserve the truth, Sophie said fiercely, and they need to pay for what they did. Claire returned to the table, sitting down beside Thomas. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked directly into his eyes without confusion or fear. I remember you, she said simply. Not everything, but enough. I remember loving you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Thomas felt tears he'd held back for 27 years finally fall. I never stopped loving you. I married Rachel because everyone said I needed to move on. But I never stopped loving you. Claire reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that hadn't been there when they were young. We lost so much time, but we found each other again, Thomas said, covering her hand with his. Against all odds, we found each other again. Sophie sat back down, the emerald ring still in her palm. So what do we do now? Those women are still out there, still free. Thomas looked around the table at these 3 remarkable women. Eleanor, who'd saved Anna's life through pure compassion. Sophie, who'd grown up strong and brave despite never knowing her father. And Claire, who'd built a new life from nothing after losing everything. Now, he said, we make sure they face justice for what they did. And then we figure out how to be a family. The DNA results arrived 3 days later, though by then they felt like a formality. Thomas sat in the Bennett living room with the sealed envelope in his hands. Surrounded by the 3 women who had become his world in the span of a week, the certainty was already there, in Sophie's mannerisms that mirrored his own, in the way Claire's memories had flooded back like a dam breaking, in the undeniable rightness of being together again. Well? Sophie asked. Sophie, her voice tight with anticipation, despite knowing what the results would say. Thomas opened the envelope and scanned the technical language until he found what they were looking for. 97% probability that I am Sophie's biological father. Sophie let out a breath she'd been holding for days. So it's real. All of it, Thomas confirmed, looking at his daughter, with wonder that still felt too enormous to contain. Claire had been quiet since her memories had fully returned, processing 27 years of stolen life. Now she spoke, her voice steady, but filled with an anger that had been building for days. I remember everything now, every detail. The way Dolores looked at me like I was dirt under her shoe. The way Rachel smiled when they locked me in that room. They knew I was pregnant, Thomas. They knew, and they didn't care. Thomas felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to build his empire. To prove himself worthy of Anna's love, was now focused on the women who had destroyed their lives. We need evidence, he said, forcing himself to think strategically. Memories won't be enough in court, especially with how much time has passed. Eleanor, who had been listening from her chair by the window, spoke up. There might be records, The hospital where I found Claire, the lawyer who paid her bills. There could be a paper trail. Sophie stood up suddenly, pacing with the same restless energy Thomas recognized in himself. There's something else. Something I should have thought of sooner. She turned to face them, her expression grim. I work for an airline. I have access to passenger manifests, flight records. If Dolores and Rachel traveled to Louisiana around the time Mom was found, there would be records. Sophie, that could get you in trouble with your job, Claire said, concern evident in her voice. Mom, they stole our entire lives. A job is nothing compared to that. Thomas watched his daughter pace, marveling at her fierce determination. She was so much like Anna, willing to fight for what was right, no matter the personal cost. There's another problem, he said quietly. Rachel is still my wife. Legally, she's entitled to half of everything I own. And my mother? She's never going to admit to what she did without a fight. Then we make sure the fight is public, Sophie said, her eyes blazing. These women destroyed our family because they thought they were untouchable. Time to prove them wrong, over the next 2 days. They worked methodically to build their case. Marcus Webb, Thomas's private investigator, proved invaluable. His contacts in law enforcement helped them trace the anonymous payments to Claire's hospital bills, which led to a law firm in Baton Rouge that had been paid in cash to handle the transactions. Meanwhile, Sophie used her airline connections to pull flight records from late 1997. What she found was damning. Dolores Granger and Rachel Thornton had flown together to New Orleans on November 15, 1997. Just 2 days before Claire was found at the hospital, they'd returned to New York the following morning. They didn't even stay to make sure I was going to live, Claire said, when Sophie showed her the records. They dumped me at that hospital and flew home like nothing had happened. Eleanor had been making calls to former colleagues at the hospital, and her efforts paid off when she reached Dr. Patricia Martinez, who had been a resident in 1997. I remember that case, Dr. Martinez told Eleanor over the phone. Young woman, severe head trauma, very pregnant. What stuck with me was how nervous the lawyers were when they came to pay the bills. They kept asking about her prognosis, whether she was likely to recover her memory. It wasn't normal concern. It felt like they were afraid of something. But their biggest breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus Webb had been quietly investigating the car accident that had supposedly killed Anna Whitaker in 1997. What he found was a masterpiece of fraud that had taken planning and resources. The body in the car wasn't Anna, Marcus explained as they gathered in the Bennett living room. It was a Jane Doe from the county morgue, a homeless woman who died of an overdose. Someone paid to have the dental records switched, the fingerprints altered. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. This was calculated. Thomas felt sick. How much did it cost them? Conservative estimate, $500,000, maybe more. The kind of money that only comes from serious wealth. Sophie was recording everything on her phone, building a digital file of evidence. We need them to confess. We have circumstantial evidence, but we need them to actually admit what they did. Sophie, these women are dangerous, Claire said, fear creeping into her voice. If they killed someone to fake my death, if they were willing to let me die in that ravine, they won't try anything now, Thomas said firmly. Too much attention. Too many people who know the truth. But Claire's right about one thing. We need to be careful how we approach this. That evening, Thomas called Rachel for the first time since arriving in New Orleans. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with barely controlled anger. Where the hell are you? Thomas, it's been a week. The board is asking questions and I'm running out of excuses. I'm coming home tomorrow, Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral. We need to talk. About what? Your mysterious business trip that no one seems to know anything about. Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. About Anna Whitaker. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Rachel finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. Cold, calculating. I don't know what you think you've discovered, Thomas, but you need to be very careful about the accusations you make. No accusations. Rachel, just facts. I found her. Another long silence. That's impossible. Is it? Because I'm looking at her right now. I'm looking at our daughter too. Sophie's beautiful, Rachel. She has my eyes. The sound Rachel made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Thomas, you don't understand. You can't understand. Everything we did to protect you. We, Thomas pressed. So you admit it. I admit nothing. Come home, Thomas. Come home and we'll discuss this like civilized people. Oh, I'm coming home, Thomas said. And I'm bringing Anna with me. I'm bringing our daughter and Rachel. We're not going to discuss anything like civilized people. We're going to discuss it like the criminals you are. He hung up before she could respond. Claire, who had been listening to the conversation, looked pale. She knows we're coming. Good, Thomas said grimly. Let her know. Let her panic. Let her make mistakes. Sophie was already researching flights on her phone. I can get us on the morning flight to New York. Employee discounts, she added with a wan smile. Eleanor stood up slowly, her age showing for the first time since Thomas had met her. I'm coming with you. Eleanor, you don't have to. Those women stole my girls, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had weathered many storms. I've been protecting Claire and Sophie for 27 years. I'm not stopping now. Thomas looked around the room at these three remarkable women who had become his family in the space of a week. Tomorrow, they would fly to New York and confront the monsters who had destroyed their lives. Tomorrow, they would demand justice for 27 years of stolen time. But tonight, for the first time in nearly 3 decades, Thomas Granger fell asleep holding the woman he loved, with his daughter sleeping safely down the hall. It wasn't the life they had planned, but it was the life they had fought to reclaim. And tomorrow, they would make sure that those who had stolen it from them would finally pay the price. Sophie lay awake in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the father she'd never known she had, the mother whose true identity had been hidden from her, and the grandmother who had sacrificed everything to keep them safe. In 12 hours, they would be on a plane to New York. In 12 hours, the real fight would begin. The flight to New York felt like traveling back in time. Thomas sat between Claire and Sophie, watching the familiar skyline of Manhattan emerge through the airplane window. The city that had been his kingdom for 27 years now felt foreign. Tainted by the knowledge of what had been built on lies, Claire gripped his hand as the plane descended, her knuckles white with tension. The closer they got to New York, the more her recovered memories seemed to weigh on her. She remembered this city as the place where her life had been stolen, where the people who claimed to love Thomas had destroyed everything good in his world. Are you sure about this? She whispered, as the landing gear touched down. Maybe we should have gone to the police first. We need them to confess, Thomas replied, though doubt gnawed at him. The evidence we have is strong, but 27 years is a long time. Witnesses die. Records disappear. We need their own words condemning them. Sophie, sitting by the window, had been unusually quiet during the flight. Now she turned to face them, her expression determined but troubled. I've been thinking about something. If they were willing to kill someone to fake Mom's death, if they left her to die in that ravine, what's to stop them from trying to finish the job now? Eleanor, sitting across the aisle, leaned forward. Because now there are 4 of us who know the truth. And because Thomas is a public figure, if anything happens to any of us, it will raise questions. Thomas wished he felt as confident as Eleanor sounded. The women who had orchestrated Anna's disappearance had shown themselves capable of careful planning and ruthless execution. They wouldn't go down without a fight. At LaGuardia, Thomas rented a car and drove them to a hotel in Midtown, far from his penthouse on the Upper East Side, but close enough to respond quickly when the time came. He'd deliberately chosen a place Rachel wouldn't think to look, a mid-range business hotel where they could plan their next moves without interference. Their first stop was Marcus Webb's office. The private investigator had been busy during their absence, and the evidence he'd compiled was staggering. I tracked down the homeless woman whose body was used in the fake accident, Marcus said, spreading files across his desk. Maria Santos, 34 years old, died of a heroin overdose 3 days before Anna supposedly died in that car crash. Her body disappeared from the county morgue the night before the accident. Claire shuddered. They used that poor woman like she was nothing. It gets worse, Marcus continued. I found the morgue attendant who was on duty that night. Took some convincing, but he finally admitted someone paid him $50,000 to look the other way. He's willing to testify in exchange for immunity. Sophie was taking notes on her phone, building their case methodically. What about the dental records, the fingerprints? The coroner who signed off on the false identification retired to Florida in 1999. He's been living well beyond his pension, house on the beach, expensive car. Someone's been supplementing his income for years. Thomas felt sick. The scope of the conspiracy was overwhelming. How many people did they buy? At least 6 that I can confirm. Morgue attendant, coroner, records clerk, the lawyer who handled the hospital payments, and 2 police officers who were first on the scene of the accident. Marcus handed Thomas a thick folder. It's all here. Names, dates, financial records. Your mother and wife built this conspiracy like a corporate project. Eleanor spoke up from her chair by the window. What about now? Are they taking any precautions since Thomas called Rachel? Marcus nodded grimly. I've been watching them both. Dolores has been making calls to lawyers, liquidating some assets. And Rachel's been making different kinds of calls. What kind of calls? Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. The kind that suggests she's not planning to go quietly, Thomas. I think you need to know. Your wife has been in contact with some very unsavory people. The kind who solve problems permanently. The hotel room fell silent. Claire moved closer to Thomas, fear evident in her eyes. Sophie stood up and began pacing, her mind clearly racing. They're going to try to kill us, Sophie said flatly, just like they tried to kill Mom 27 years ago. We don't know that for certain, Thomas said, but even he didn't believe it. Yes, we do, Claire said quietly. I know these women, Thomas. I've remembered enough to understand what they're capable of. They destroyed my life once without hesitation. They won't hesitate to do it again. Eleanor looked older than her 78 years as she absorbed this information. So what do? Run. No, Sophie said firmly. We don't run, we fight back, but we fight smart. Over the next hour, they developed a plan that was part sting operation, part public relations campaign. Sophie would use her skills with social media to document everything, creating a digital record that couldn't be suppressed. Eleanor would stay at the hotel with Marcus, safe but available to coordinate with law enforcement. When the time came, Thomas and Claire would confront Dolores and Rachel together, but not alone. Marcus had arranged for several witnesses to be present, journalists, lawyers, and a private security team that would record everything. The key is getting them to talk, Marcus explained. We need them to admit what they did, on camera, with witnesses present. Once they confess, the rest of the evidence will support the charges. Thomas was reviewing the plan when his phone rang. Dolores. Thomas. Darling, you need to come home. This nonsense has gone on long enough. Hello, Mother. I'm in the city. We should talk. Yes, we should. Tonight. At the house. Just the family. Thomas exchanged glances with Claire. His mother's voice was too controlled, too carefully modulated. Just the family. You, me, and Rachel. It's time to put this unfortunate business behind us. I'll be there at 8, Thomas said. And Mother? I'm bringing Anna. The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line was audible. Thomas, you're not thinking clearly. The woman you think is Anna. Is Anna? DNA doesn't lie, Mother. Neither do the flight records showing you and Rachel in New Orleans the day she was found. A long pause. 8 o'clock, Thomas. Don't keep us waiting. The line went dead. Thomas looked around the room at the faces staring back at him. Claire, pale but determined. Sophie, furious and ready for battle. Eleanor, worried but supportive. Marcus, professionally grim. They know we're coming, Claire said. Good, Thomas replied. Let them prepare. Let them think they're in control. It will make their downfall all the sweeter. But even as he spoke the words, Thomas felt a chill of apprehension. The women who had orchestrated Anna's disappearance had been planning for 27 years. They'd had time to prepare for this moment. Time to arrange contingencies. Sophie seemed to read his thoughts. Dad, she said, and the words still made his heart skip. What if this is exactly what they want? What if they're luring us into a trap? Then we spring it on our terms, Thomas said, though privately he shared her concerns. Marcus, how quickly can you get your people in place? They're already in place. The house has been under surveillance since yesterday. Nothing goes in or out without us knowing about it. Thomas nodded, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. At 8 o'clock tonight, he would walk into his childhood home with the woman he'd thought was dead for 27 years. He would confront his mother and wife with evidence of their crimes, demand justice for the years they'd stolen. But as afternoon turned to evening, as they made their final preparations, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Dolores and Rachel had been preparing for this confrontation far longer than he had. They'd proven themselves capable of murder, fraud, and decades of deception. What else were they capable of? At 7:30, Thomas and Claire left the hotel together, in the car. Claire reached for his hand. "Whatever happens tonight," she said, "I want you to know that finding you again has been worth everything. Even if we only have these few days. It's been worth 27 years of not knowing." Thomas squeezed her hand, thinking about the daughter they'd raised apart, the life they'd been denied, the love that had survived even the cruelest conspiracy. "It's not going to end tonight," he promised her. "We're going to have our life together. All of us, Sophie, Eleanor, you and me, we're going to have the family they tried to destroy." As they drove through the streets of Manhattan toward the confrontation that would determine their future, neither of them noticed the black sedan following 3 cars behind. The Granger family mansion stood like a fortress on Fifth Avenue, its limestone facade glowing under the streetlights. Thomas had grown up in this house, had brought Anna here once to meet his parents back when the future seemed bright and full of promise. Now, returning with her 27 years later, the building felt more like a mausoleum than a home. "I remember this place," Claire whispered as they sat in the car across the street. "Your mother invited me here for dinner once, early in our relationship. She spent the entire evening making sure I understood I didn't belong." Thomas squeezed her hand. "You belong here more than anyone. This should have been your home." Marcus's voice crackled through their earpieces. "We're in position. Audio and video are recording. Security team has eyes on all exits. Whatever happens, we've got you covered." At exactly 8 o'clock, Thomas and Claire approached the front door. Thomas used his key, leading Claire into the marble foyer that had intimidated him as a child. The house was eerily quiet, their footsteps echoing off the high ceilings. "Thomas, is that you, darling?" Dolores Granger appeared at the top of the grand staircase, descending like a queen granting an audience. At 79, she was still an imposing figure. Perfectly coiffed silver hair, designer dress, jewelry that cost more than most people's houses, but Thomas could see something different in her eyes now. Fear, carefully masked, but definitely there. "Mother." Thomas's voice was ice cold. "I believe you remember Anna." Dolores's gaze shifted to Claire, and for just a moment, her composure cracked. "I remember Anna Whitaker died in a car accident 27 years ago. This woman is obviously disturbed, taking advantage of your grief." "Cut the act, Mother. We know everything." Rachel emerged from the living room, and Thomas felt Claire tense beside him. His wife looked haggard, her usual polished appearance replaced by something wild and desperate. She'd been drinking. Thomas could see it in the slight unsteadiness of her movements, the too bright glitter in her eyes. Well, Rachel said, her voice slurring slightly. "The ghost returns, tell me. Anna, how does it feel to come back from the dead?" Claire straightened, drawing on reserves of strength Thomas recognized from their youth. "It feels like justice, Rachel. Finally. Justice," Dolores laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "You want to talk about justice? I protected my son from a gold-digging little nobody who would have ruined his life. That's justice. You kidnapped a pregnant woman and left her to die," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. "That's not justice. That's attempted murder." "Prove it," Rachel snapped, moving closer. "Prove any of it. You think anyone will believe the word of a woman with brain damage against 2 pillars of New York society?" Thomas smiled grimly. "I don't have to prove anything, Rachel. You're going to prove it for me." He pulled out his phone and played a recording. Rachel's voice filled the room, slightly distorted by phone static but clearly audible. "Everything we did to protect you. I admit nothing. You don't understand, you can't understand." Rachel's face went white. "You recorded our conversation, among other things." Thomas gestured to Claire, who pulled out her own phone. "Go ahead, Anna. Show them what Sophie found." Claire's fingers trembled slightly as she navigated to the airline records Sophie had compiled. Flight 847, November 15, 1997. 2 passengers. Dolores Granger and Rachel Thornton. Destination, New Orleans. Return flight, November 16, 1997. The day after I was found at the hospital. Circumstantial, Dolores said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Thomas pulled out Marcus's folder. What about the morgue attendant who was paid $50,000 to look the other way when Maria Santos's body disappeared? What about the coroner who falsified the dental records? What about the 27 years of anonymous payments to keep Anna's medical care funded while ensuring she never recovered her memory? The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Thomas watched his mother and wife process the scope of the evidence against them, saw the moment when they realized their carefully constructed lies were crumbling. "You can't prove any of this," Rachel said finally, but desperation was creeping into her voice. "Can't I?" Thomas stepped closer. "Marcus Webb has been very thorough. Bank records, phone records, witness statements. It's all there, Rachel. 27 years of evidence, and it all points to you and my mother." Dolores was calculating now, her legal mind working through possibilities. "Even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not admitting anything, the statute of limitations doesn't apply to kidnapping, attempted murder, or conspiracy," Claire interrupted. "I looked it up. There's no statute of limitations on what you did to me." Rachel laughed, the sound high and hysterical. "So what? You think you can just waltz back into our lives and destroy everything we've built? Thomas married me, Anna. We've been together for 25 years. I'm his wife. You're his wife because you murdered someone to fake my death," Claire shot back. "Your entire marriage is built on a crime, built on necessity," Dolores snapped, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking. "Thomas was throwing his life away on a secretary from Queens. You would have dragged him down to your level, made him ordinary. I loved him," Claire said simply. "That's all I ever wanted, to love him and build a life together." "Love," Rachel's voice was vicious now. "You think love matters? Thomas needed someone who could match his ambition, who understood his world. Someone worthy of the Granger name. Someone like you," Thomas asked, his voice cutting. "Someone who would kidnap and attempt to murder an innocent woman. Someone who would steal a man's child from him. Tell me, Rachel, what part of that made you worthy?" Rachel's composure shattered completely. "I did it for you. Everything I did because I loved you. More than she ever could. More than anyone ever could. You did it because you were obsessed," Thomas replied coldly. "And because you were too selfish to accept that I could never love you the way I loved Anna." "Loved." Rachel's eyes were wild now. "Past tense, Thomas. Because you haven't loved anyone in 27 years. You've been a ghost, going through the motions. Even when you married me, even when you tried to build a life, you were always mourning her." The truth of her words hit Thomas like a physical blow because they were accurate. He had been a ghost, living a half-life while the woman he loved suffered with amnesia hundreds of miles away. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was mourning her. I mourned her every day for 27 years. But she's alive, Rachel. She's here, and she remembers everything now. All your crimes, all your lies. She remembers it all." Claire stepped forward, her voice strong and clear. "I remember the farmhouse where you kept me. I remember the cold way you looked at me when you said I wasn't good enough for Thomas. I remember running through the woods while you hunted me like an animal. And I remember falling into that ravine because I was so desperate to get back to the man I loved and tell him about our child." "Our child," Thomas repeated, the words heavy with meaning. "The daughter you stole from me, Rachel. The daughter who grew up believing her father was dead because you and my mother decided to play God with our lives." Dolores was backing toward the staircase now, her face a mask of fury and desperation. "You can't prove any of this in court. The evidence is too old. The witnesses unreliable. Then I guess we'll have to rely on your confession," Thomas said calmly. "What confession?" Thomas smiled, pulling out his phone and stopping the recording app. "The one you've been giving for the last 10 minutes. Did you really think I'd walk into this house without recording everything?" The blood drained from Dolores's face. Rachel swayed on her feet, the full implications hitting her. "You recorded us," Rachel whispered. "Every word, including your admission that you did it all for love, and Mother's explanation of why Anna wasn't worthy of the Granger name. A jury is going to love hearing that." Rachel's face contorted with rage. "You think you've won. You think you can just destroy our lives and walk away. You destroyed your own lives," Claire said, "the moment you decided that love wasn't enough, that Thomas's happiness didn't matter if it didn't fit your plans. My happiness never mattered to either of you," Thomas added. Miss, only your own. Only what you wanted. Rachel reached into her purse, and Thomas saw the glint of metal. Claire saw it too, and stepped protectively in front of him. Rachel, don't, Thomas warned. But Rachel was beyond reason now, beyond fear of consequences. 27 years of living a lie, of knowing her marriage was built on murder, had finally broken something inside her. If I can't have you, she said, raising the gun with shaking hands, then no one can. The gun in Rachel's hand trembled as she aimed it at Claire, 27 years of hatred and jealousy burning in her eyes. You should have stayed dead, she hissed. You should have died in that ravine like you were supposed to. Thomas stepped forward, his hands raised. Rachel, put the gun down. This won't solve anything. Won't it? Rachel's laugh was brittle, dangerous. You think I'm going to prison for her? You think I'm going to lose everything because some nobody crawled out of her grave? You lost everything the moment you decided to destroy innocent lives, Claire said, her voice steady despite the weapon pointed at her heart. Marcus's voice crackled urgently through their earpieces. NYPD is 30 seconds out. Keep them talking. But Rachel was beyond rational thought. Her finger tightened on the trigger just as the front door burst open. Sophie stood in the doorway. Her phone raised, live streaming everything. Don't you dare! Sophie shouted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd inherited her father's steel. The whole world is watching, Rachel. Thousands of people are seeing this live right now. Rachel spun towards Sophie, confusion momentarily breaking through her rage. What? Social media, Rachel. Welcome to the digital age. Sophie's fingers moved across her phone screen as she spoke. I've been broadcasting everything for the last 10 minutes. Every confession, every admission of guilt. It's already been shared hundreds of times. Thomas saw his opportunity. While Rachel was distracted, he lunged forward, grabbing her wrist and forcing the gun upward. The weapon discharged, the shot echoing through the marble foyer as plaster rained down from the ceiling. Police sirens wailed outside as Thomas wrestled the gun away from Rachel. She collapsed against him, sobbing hysterically. I loved you, she kept repeating. I loved you so much. That wasn't love, Thomas said sadly. Love doesn't destroy people. Dolores had tried to slip away during the chaos, but Marcus's security team blocked her path to the back exit. She stood frozen on the staircase. Her aristocratic composure finally shattered as police officers flooded into the house. Dolores, Granger, and Rachel Thornton, Detective Maria Santos announced, holding up her badge. You're under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, attempted murder, and fraud. As they read the women their rights, Thomas wrapped his arms around Claire and Sophie, his family, finally, completely together for the first time in 27 years. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. 2 months later, the annual Granger Foundation Gala had always been the social event of the New York season. This year, however, it carried special significance. Thomas had insisted on going forward with the event, despite everything, but with one crucial difference. This gala would serve as the public vindication that he, Claire, and Sophie deserved. The ballroom at the Plaza Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and the cream of New York society. Thomas stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of people who had known him for decades, but were about to learn the truth about his life. Claire sat at the head table, elegant in a midnight blue gown that matched her eyes. Beside her, Sophie wore the emerald ring on a chain around her neck, no longer a mystery, but a symbol of love that had survived the worst imaginable betrayal. Eleanor, resplendent in silver silk, beamed with pride at her girls. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed ballroom. 27 years ago, I stood in a cemetery and buried the woman I loved more than life itself. Tonight, I want to tell you about the miracle of her resurrection. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Many of these people had attended Anna's funeral, had consoled Thomas in his grief, had celebrated his eventual marriage to Rachel. But first, I want to tell you about justice. Thomas's voice hardened. 2 weeks ago, Dolores Granger and Rachel Thornton were sentenced to 25 years to life for conspiracy, kidnapping, attempted murder, and multiple counts of fraud. They will spend the rest of their lives in prison for crimes that stole 27 years from my family. The murmur became a roar of shocked conversation. Thomas raised his hand for silence. The woman they tried to kill was Anna Whitaker, my fiancée, who was 3 months pregnant with my child when they kidnapped her in 1997. They faked her death, used the body of a homeless woman to create a false accident, and left Anna to die in a ravine in Louisiana. Claire stood up, moving to join Thomas at the podium. Together, they faced the crowd that had believed in their separation for so long. Anna survived, Thomas continued. Thomas, his hand finding hers. She suffered severe amnesia and lived for 27 years as Claire Bennett, raising our daughter Sophie with the help of Eleanor Bennett, the angel who saved them both. Sophie joined them on stage. The 3 generations of their story, finally united in public. I grew up believing my father was dead, Sophie said into the microphone, her voice clear and strong. I never knew that he was alive, mourning a love that evil people had stolen from him. But love finds a way. Love endures. The ballroom erupted in applause. But Thomas wasn't finished. This foundation, he said, gesturing to encompass the gala around them, has always been dedicated to helping families in crisis. Tonight, I'm announcing a new initiative. The Anna Whitaker Fund will provide resources for missing persons cases, support for amnesia patients, and assistance for families torn apart by crime. He turned to Claire, his voice thick with emotion. Anna, would you do me the honor of accepting the position of executive director? Claire's eyes filled with tears. I would be honored. And Sophie, Thomas continued, I know you love your job with the airline, but I'm hoping you'll consider joining Granger Industries as vice president of operations. It's time you learned the family business. Sophie grinned, looking so much like her father that several people in the audience gasped. I thought you'd never ask. Eleanor was crying openly now, watching her girls claim their rightful place in the world they'd been denied for so long. Thomas faced the crowd one final time. The people who destroyed my family thought they were untouchable. They thought wealth and social position put them above justice. They were wrong. Truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it's buried. Love has a way of enduring, no matter how viciously it's attacked. He raised his champagne glass. Tonight, we celebrate not just the Granger Foundation, but the triumph of love over evil, of family over conspiracy, of truth over lies. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you my wife, Anna Granger, and my daughter, Sophie Granger. The applause was thunderous, as the crowd rose to their feet in ovation. Thomas pulled Claire close and kissed her, sealing their reunion in front of the society that had once mourned their separation. Later, as the gala wound down, the family found themselves alone on the hotel's terrace, looking out over the city lights. Eleanor sat in a comfortable chair, watching her granddaughter dance with her father to music only they could hear. You know, Eleanor said to Claire, I always wondered if this day would come. Deep down, I always hoped someone would come looking for you. Claire squeezed the older woman's hand. You gave me everything, Eleanor. You gave me Sophie. You gave me a home. You gave me love when I had nothing. I can never repay that. You don't need to repay anything, honey. Seeing you happy, seeing you whole again, that's payment enough. Thomas approached them, having left Sophie to mingle with the remaining guests. Eleanor, I have something for you. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a deed. Eleanor stared at it in confusion. Thomas, what is this? The deed to a house in New Orleans. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, in the Garden District. I thought you might like to have a place to visit when you want to escape New York winters. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Thomas, I can't accept this. You can, and you will, Thomas said firmly. You saved my family, Eleanor. You gave me back everything that mattered. A house is the least I can do. Sophie rejoined them, slightly breathless from dancing. What's everyone crying about? Happy tears, Claire said, pulling her daughter close. Just happy tears, as they stood together on the terrace, watching the city that had both destroyed and reunited their family. Thomas felt a peace he hadn't known in 27 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, integrating their lives, healing old wounds, building a future from the ashes of the past. But tonight, they were together. Tonight, love had won, and in the distance, the lights of New York sparkled like stars, bearing witness to a love story that had survived the worst imaginable betrayal and emerged stronger than ever. 1 year later, the morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Patrick's Cathedral, casting rainbow patterns across the stone floor where Thomas and Anna had first met 30 years ago. It wasn't the same little church where Anna had once dreamed of their wedding, but it felt right, a place of new beginnings built on the foundation of enduring faith. Thomas adjusted his tie for what felt like the 100th time, his hands trembling slightly with nerves that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with joy. At 53, he was about to marry the woman he'd loved since he was 25, the woman he'd mourned for 27 years, the woman who had come back to him like a miracle. "Dad, you're going to wear out that tie," Sophie said, appearing at his elbow in her maid of honor dress, a soft rose gold that complemented her mother's ivory gown perfectly. At 27, she'd seamlessly stepped into her role as Thomas's daughter and business partner, bringing fresh perspectives to Granger Industries while learning the empire her father had built in her absence. "I can't help it," Thomas admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've waited 30 years for this moment." 27, Sophie corrected with a gentle smile. "But who's counting?" Marcus Webb, serving as Thomas's best man, clapped him on the shoulder. "She's not going to change her mind, Thomas. Not after everything you've both been through." Through the cathedral doors, Thomas could see the guests arriving. New York society had turned out in force, curious to witness the wedding that had become the most talked about love story in the city. But Thomas only had eyes for the people who truly mattered. Eleanor, radiant in purple silk, taking her place in the front pew, Dr. Martinez, who had flown in from New Orleans, the former hospital workers who had cared for Anna during her recovery. Even Maria Santos's sister, who had become an advocate for homeless rights after learning how her sister's body had been used in the conspiracy. The organ music swelled, and Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. This was it. After 3 decades of love, loss, separation, and reunion, Anna Whitaker was finally going to become Anna Granger. Sophie squeezed his arm before taking her place at the altar. "She's beautiful, Dad. You're both going to be so happy." The doors at the back of the cathedral opened, and Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Anna appeared, radiant in a simple but elegant ivory gown that she'd designed and sewn herself. It was similar to the dress she'd been making 30 years ago, but refined by the wisdom and grace that came with surviving unimaginable hardship. But it was Eleanor walking beside her that made Thomas's eyes fill with tears. The woman who had saved Anna's life, who had raised Sophie with love and wisdom, who had become the mother Anna had never known. Eleanor was giving the bride away, representing all the love that had sustained their family through the darkest times. As they walked down the aisle, Thomas saw Anna's eyes find his and hold them. In that gaze, he saw everything. Their young love, the pain of separation, the miracle of rediscovery, and the promise of a future they would finally share. When they reached the altar, Eleanor kissed Anna's cheek and placed her hand in Thomas's. "Take care of my girl," she whispered, though her eyes were shining with joy rather than sadness. "Always," Thomas promised. Father Murphy, who had known Thomas since childhood, smiled at the couple before beginning the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness a love story that proves the power of faith, hope, and enduring devotion. Thomas and Anna, your journey to this altar has been longer and more difficult than most, but it has also been a testament to the truth that love conquers all." As the priest spoke about love's ability to survive even the gravest trials, Thomas thought about the year that had passed since the gala. It hadn't always been easy. Anna had struggled with nightmares about her captivity, and Thomas had battled guilt over the years they'd lost. Sophie had needed time to adjust to having a father in her life, and Eleanor had worried about her girls forgetting their New Orleans roots. But they'd worked through each challenge together, with family therapy, patience, and the unshakable foundation of love that had brought them back to each other. Anna had thrown herself into her work with the foundation, using her experience to help other families torn apart by crime. Sophie had proven herself a natural businesswoman, bringing innovations to Granger Industries that honored both profit and principle. Eleanor had become the family matriarch she'd always been meant to be, spending half her time in New York and half in the beautiful Garden District house Thomas had bought her. "Thomas," Father Murphy said, "do you take Anna to be your wife? To love and cherish her in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Thomas said, his voice strong and clear. I've been taking her as my wife in my heart for 30 years. Today just makes it official." Laughter rippled through the congregation, but Anna's eyes were serious as she spoke her own vows. "Anna, do you take Thomas to be your husband, to love and honor him through all of life's challenges and joys?" "I do," Anna said, her voice carrying the weight of everything they'd endured. "I took him as my husband the day he proposed 30 years ago. I never stopped being his wife, even when I couldn't remember his name." Thomas slipped the wedding ring, a new one, but designed to complement the emerald engagement ring she wore, onto Anna's finger. Anna did the same with his ring, her hands steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "By the power vested in me by God and the state of New York," Father Murphy pronounced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife, Thomas. You may kiss your bride." The kiss was tender, reverent, full of 30 years of longing finally fulfilled. When they broke apart, the cathedral erupted in applause and cheers. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Thomas caught sight of Rachel and Dolores's former friends in the congregation. Some had come out of genuine happiness for his newfound joy, but others had come out of curiosity or social obligation. It didn't matter. Nothing could diminish this moment. The reception was held at the Plaza Hotel, in the same ballroom where Thomas had revealed the truth about his family a year ago. But where that night had been about justice and vindication, tonight was pure celebration. Sophie gave a toast that brought the house down. "A year ago, I thought I was an orphan with a grandmother and an amnesiac mother. Tonight, I'm a Granger with two parents who love each other more than anything in the world, plus the best grandmother anyone could ask for. Sometimes the best families are the ones you have to fight for." Eleanor's toast was simpler, but no less moving. To Anna and Thomas, "May your second chance be everything your first chance should have been." But it was Anna's words that stopped the room cold. 30 years ago, I was planning to tell the man I loved that we were going to have a baby. Evil people stole that moment from us, stole 27 years of our lives. But they couldn't steal our love, they couldn't steal our daughter, and they couldn't steal our future. She raised her champagne glass. "Tonight, I want to tell that same man something else, Thomas. We're going to have another baby." The ballroom fell silent for a heartbeat, then exploded in shocked joy. Thomas stared at Anna, his face cycling through disbelief, wonder, and pure elation. "Are you serious?" he managed. 8 weeks, Anna said, her hand moving to her still flat stomach. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to surprise you." Thomas swept her into his arms, spinning her around as the crowd cheered. Sophie was crying and laughing simultaneously, while Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. Later, as the reception wound down, the family found themselves on the hotel terrace again, looking out over the city that had witnessed both their greatest sorrow and their greatest joy. "A baby," Thomas said, still unable to quite believe it. "At our age, love doesn't have an expiration date," Anna replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Besides, Sophie's going to need someone to boss around when she takes over the company." Sophie laughed. "I'm going to be the best big sister in the world. This kid is going to be so spoiled." Eleanor smiled, watching her family with deep contentment. Some stories have happy endings after all. As they stood together under the stars, Thomas thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The young man who had fallen in love with a secretary from Queens could never have imagined the trials that lay ahead, but he also couldn't have imagined the depth of love that would sustain them through everything. "I have something to tell you all," Thomas said suddenly. "I've been thinking about scaling back my role at the company, spending more time with family." Anna smiled. "What would you do with yourself?" "I was thinking about teaching. Maybe business classes at the local college, sharing what I've learned about building something that lasts." "What you've learned," Sophie said thoughtfully, "is that the only thing that really lasts is love." Thomas pulled his wife and daughter closer, with Eleanor's hand warm on his arm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. A pregnancy at Anna's age wouldn't be without risks. Sophie would continue learning to balance her heritage with her ambitions. Eleanor would keep being the glue that held them all together. But tonight, under the New York sky, Thomas Granger was exactly where he belonged, with his wife in his arms, his daughter by his side, and his family complete at last. "We lost 27 years, my love," he whispered to Anna as the city sparkled below them. "But we have the rest of our lives ahead of us," she whispered back. And as the cathedral bells chimed midnight, marking the beginning of their new life together, Thomas knew that some love stories are worth waiting a lifetime to complete.